Preface. Welcome to the world of Aeros, a small partial of Earth, 42 miles north to south and 84 miles east to west. Aeros is 3,500 square miles of magic and erotic wonderment. Aeros existed in a time when time was no taskmaster, and saw numerous sentient species living in a harmonious synergy. That is until certain villainous forces decided that such harmony offended them, and must therefore be destroyed, as villainous forces always seem to do. Aeros was a land which lived before erotic behavior was deemed inappropriate to display in polite society. There were no sexually transmitted diseases, and casual sex was the accepted norm. Jealousy was nearly non-existent, and most if not all marriages were open. People of all sentient species were delightfully innocent in regard to all things erotic. They enjoyed each other without the guilt most societies attach. All-out war had not occurred in centuries. Each different species kept trained troops basically just to settle the minor skirmishes which transpired at times, and act as a police force. But since the Bartane elves had conquered the Gunaranese 1,000 years prior, nothing approaching a major war had reared its ugly head. But any utopia will eventually be accosted by a villain who seeks to end the harmony in an effort to perpetuate their own evil intent. This is the story of how one villain makes her bid to conquer Aeros and make it her own, and how the very elements of the earth generated a heroine to stand in her way. Welcome to the world of Aeros. Chapter 1. Captivity. Dark. Shanaea peered into the void which surrounded her, desperately seeking any small point of light. But she was disappointed. Not that she expected different. A proc-ogre dungeon was by rule pitch black. Disorientation was key to maintaining the submissive state of mind the ogres required of their prisoners. How long had it been? It seemed an eternity, yet she knew it was but a matter of days since the ogres, aided by a high-echelon Marfo witch, had subdued and imprisoned her. Just why was a Marfo witch involved with proc-ogres in the first place? The two races were sworn enemies by nature, but this was a matter Shanaea would ponder at a later point in time, as her major concern as of now was how to escape them. Shanaea stretched her long, elegant frame out on the cold stone floor of the dungeon in an effort to relax. She needed her consciousness completely focused on the matter at hand. Yet relieving her mind of the discomfort she was experiencing physically was difficult at best, nearly impossible in fact. Cold, hungry, dehydrated, and frightened, she tried to muster all the massive mental capacity the magnificence of her diverse genealogy empowered her with. But the circumstances she was facing at the time hindered her greatly. If she could but achieve splendetta, the euphoric state of the Manista wherein the mind overcomes all external stimuli, thus increasing its capacity exponentially, she could possibly contrive a method for overcoming her captors and facilitating an escape. But a proc-ogre dungeon was designed to, among other things, render achieving splendetta nearly impossible. Shanaea was a gorgeous creature. Proc-ogres, as ugly and uncouth as they are, have high standards concerning the females they enslave, and Shanaea more than exceeded them. Her genealogy not only made her one of the most intelligent creatures in Aeros, but perhaps the loveliest as well. Her long, slender stature, she stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, and her high cheekbones she inherited from her father, a half-elf, half-Manista. Her overly large sapphire eyes, full ruby-red lips, long articulate fingers and toes, thick jet-black hair and fair complexion, not to mention the majority of her magical inclinations, she inherited from her mother, a Genarian Sprite. Her elegant stained glass dragonfly wings had unfortunately been clipped upon her capture, but they would grow back quickly enough, and she would fly again. She could hear the ogres gathering outside her cell once again, and she knew they would soon be back to inflict more torture upon her. She was uncertain of how many times the various ogres had visited her thus far, but she was definitely certain she despised the touch of these foul creatures. The Manista portion of her genealogy was most offended by what had transpired since her abduction, and was already plotting her revenge if and when she should escape. But she feared she had more dire consequences to endure right now. Shanaea heard the low, melodic voice of the Marfo witch dispersing orders to the ogres outside her cell door. She couldn't make out the entire order, but prepare the table and bring the instruments resonated clearly. Shanaea had never been violated by a Marfo witch before, and under the current circumstances, she was positive that she did not want to be. Marfa witches are named so due to the fact that they are both male and female, though they appear female for the most part, and are commonly referred to as such. They each have functioning reproductive organs of both genders, and can both conceive or father an offspring. Hence the name Marfo, a shortening of hermaphrodite, and witch, due to the potent brand of magic they practiced. Their long jet-black hair frames alluring round cherubic faces. They are considered full-grown adults at 38 years and stand about 5'8" at that point. Their large, round breasts stay firm throughout their 250 to 300-year lifespans, and they are able to both father and conceive offspring until well past 200. They are equipped with fully functioning mammary glands. They produce milk constantly, whether with child or not, and that milk is so delicious it is considered both a delicacy and an addictive drug. Their webbed fingers and toes sport long, hard nails which can claw through a boulder. They are expertly versed at spells and curses, especially those of the sexual variety. The Climaxus Mortis spell, probably the most severe spell of the many Marfo witches can cast, can, and most often does, cause a person to experience orgasm until they can no longer draw breath. In other words, the spell was fatal nearly every time it was cast. Shania heard the door latch rattle, and as the creaky old cell door slowly opened, the light from the torch the witch was holding seemed like 1,000 suns had suddenly materialized in the cold blackness. As her eyes finally adjusted to the sudden change in luminescence, she looked down to see one of the 2 ogres which accompanied the Marfo witch attach a condyle to her wrist. This was a necessity for her captors, as a Genarian sprite draws her magical countenance from any surrounding light source, and the condyle would counter that, rendering Shania devoid of any magical ability. The ogres had also brought a small trunk into the cell, which Shania assumed contained the instruments the Marfo witch had mentioned.
Greetings to the lovely Shania.
The Marfo witch chimed in her low, melodious voice as she handed the torch to an ogre.
Minerva is my name, and I am the Palatar of the 11th Order of Panatesis. I hope you are not offended by the lack of hospitality you have endured thus far, but it is necessary to perpetuate the mental incapacity we require of our guests here.
Great,
Shania thought.
Not just any Marfo witch, but the fucking Palatar from the most domineering and violent order ever to occupy Aeros.
Shania answered,
Oh, on the contrary, I have found the accommodations to exceed my highest expectations, considering the high repute of my captors.
Minerva chuckled under her breath and replied,
I see you still maintain that lofty elvish spirit. Difficult to break, so I am told. But break it we will. But come, dear, you must be famished. Drink,
Minerva said, as she extended to Shania a flagon filled with Marfo witch milk. Shania wanted to resist. Giving in to Minerva at this early point in the game would be admittedly a defeat, but Shania's empty belly coupled with the delightful aroma of the witch milk was more than she could withstand. She allowed Minerva to hold her up as she poured the delicious draught down her starving throat. The 106-degree heat of Minerva's body felt comforting to Shania's flesh after days in the cold Proc-Ogre dungeon, and she instinctively pressed her body tightly against her captors. As the delicious, warm Marfo witch milk filled her hungry mouth, Shania felt Minerva's male member stiffen against her leg. The Genarian sprite in her found this intriguing, but after all the torture the ogres had subjected her to, Shania was in no mood to encourage Minerva in a romantic or any other manner. But Scrog, one of the ogres who accompanied Minerva, felt differently.
Madam Minerva, you ought to do that pretty little sprite till she screams like a barn owl.
Shut up, Scrog, you intellectual indigent. We have more important tasks to accomplish tonight to waste time satisfying your pitiful voyeurism.
Then Minerva said in a much gentler tone,
Finish your meal first, my dear. Drink until you've had your fill, my darling, and then we will decide the fate of your pretty little Genarian sprite body.
Even as Shania devoured the milk, which on top of being as sweet as the honey from the combs of Dawn Avarice, and as nourishing as the bread from the elvish ovens of Beniscus, and was donated from an absolutely gorgeous Marfo witch breast, she was still painfully aware of the chest full of instruments of torture which awaited her. This could be a long night indeed. Oddicum paced the floor of his study in the palace of Beniscus in a slow, haphazard manner. Not that he was conscious of his actions. Deep within the state of Splendetta, he was barely aware of the movements of his physical body at all. Renata, his beloved sworn concubine, sat and watched, her wings twitching gently behind the back of her chair. She saw the elven Minista Lord's face contort and spasm, a physical side effect the Splendetta often caused. She dared not speak for fear of breaking Splendetta and disrupting the train of thought which might lead to the solution Oticum was seeking. The last report their daughter Shania had sent was puzzling at the least, but remarkable would be more accurate. A Marfo witch leading a horde of proc ogres. Had such a thing ever occurred in Aeros before? Why exactly would the Order of Panatesis enlist the aid of such mindless creatures? And why had they not received a report from their daughter in over 4 days now? The runner who last reported had stated that Shania, along with a small detachment of gnomes, were encamped upon the southern edge of the forest of Penichery and were spying upon the ogres when they discovered the presence of the Marfo witch. No report has come since. Gnomes. Shania dearly loved these sweet little creatures, and they loved Shania as well. Loyal to a fault, if a gnome befriends you, you have a friend for life. Gnomes were not the bearded little fattened creatures folklore has portrayed them as. In fact, male gnomes are virtually hairless aside from the dense patch of pubic hair they each possessed. Small, standing just over 4½ feet in height, slender, nimble, quick and stealthy. A gnome could position himself in close proximity, and even the most magically or intellectually perceptive most likely would not detect his presence. Gnomes could withstand extreme heat or cold, and therefore only needed a minimalistic amount of clothing regardless of the weather. Their lifespans were on average around 400 years, but it was not awfully uncommon to see a gnome pass 500. Old age was not a condition gnomes were subject to. Once they were fully grown, at 46 years, they didn't change physically until their death. Female gnomes were quite different in appearance from the males. They possessed all the attributes of the male of the species, but were China doll gorgeous, whereas the males, although cute, were rather plain in appearance compared to the females. And to have an encounter with a gnome maiden was truly a wondrous endeavor. Gnomish working ladies always commanded top dollar at the splurt houses, and for good reason. The pheromones their bodies excreted were alone enough to thrust a male of any species into a state of erotic madness. Perfumes derived from gnomish pheromones were among the most expensive in Aeros. Even though they were small in stature, a gnome maiden could handle a rock giant with no physical discomfort. Yet if a male gnome followed the rock giant, the lady gnome was still as pleasant to encounter as she was on the day her maidenhead was first compromised. Nothing felt as pleasant to a male of any species as a gnomish maid. And the fact that female gnomes could only become impregnated if they desired to do so made them ideal for working the splurt houses. The gnome's magic was basic and earthy. The bulk of their spells were concerned with making things grow. A gnome could grow lilies in a desert. Their magic makes soil that was devoid of nutrient inexplicably nourish flora, the likes of which is unrivaled in Aeros. Gnome gardens, both flower and vegetable, along with the sale of perfumes, provide the bulk of the income of gnome villages, as all species of Aeros were dependent on their yields. And so, this is the reason that today many gardens have ceramic gnomes guarding their borders, even with the portly bearded inaccuracies therein. But we digress. This may happen often. Renata knew the gnomes would never abandon Shania to the ogres, so why had no word came concerning her current fate? Suddenly, the door of the study burst open. A half-elf named Janirid, the captain of the Boniscan infantry, injured to near the point of death, stumbled through, fell to his knees and muttered in broken, pained tones that Shania had been captured. Ogres and Minerva were repeated several times. Breeding and overrun were some of the other words he was able to mutter, as well as conspiracy. He was ghostly pale, and as he spoke the last few words, he passed out on the floor of the study. Oticum snapped abruptly out of Splendetta and knelt beside his captain as Janirid lost consciousness. Puzzled by Janirid's broken statement, Oticum wondered out loud.
Minerva. Conspiracy? Why would the Palatar of the 11th Order of Panatesis be conspiring with proc ogres? Breeding? What does it mean? Renata, summon the healers.
Meanwhile, roughly 33 miles away, Jerome, brother to Oticum and uncle to Shania, knelt, hidden in the cover of a burny thistle bush, listening intently. Odd noises were coming from the Dysilry, the stronghold of the 11th Order of Panatesis. Just to the northwest of the Forest of Panicheri, the Dysilry had stood for centuries, and had in that period housed the Order of Panatesis, from the 3rd through the current 11th Order. No one knows where the witches dwelled prior to the 3rd Order, as until that point they had not yet appeared in Aeros. From whence they came no one, supposedly not even the Marfa witches themselves, really knew. Speculation that they were exiled from across the Aegean Sea 8 generations ago, a Marfa witch generation is roughly 200 years, was no more than that. A folk tale handed down from since time wasn't measured, but tonight screams emanated from the usually quiet and subdued Dysilry. Deep, guttural, torturous screams. Jerome knew those screams were that of proc-ogres. Whether they were having physical pain administered, or if intense pleasure from one or more of the many sensual curses the Marfa witches were noted for conjuring was the source of these emanations, he did not know. But regardless, pleasure or pain or both, these beings were being tortured all the same. Not that Jerome had any particular love for proc-ogres, but witnessing any creature being tortured turned his stomach. Jerome was a Minister. At one point in his life, a very high-ranking Minister in the court of Dunbury, the Minister capital. The Minister are a proud race, proud and powerful. Awesome physical specimens, Minister males towered over most other species, standing at an average height of 6'10", but can reach heights over 7 feet, and weighing in at a muscular 350 pounds. Only a rock giant, standing at just over 9 feet, could look down at a full-grown Minister. Dark olive complexions, long angular faces, and deep luminescent brown eyes comprise the roughly handsome facial features of the Minister male. Minister usually remain strong and spry throughout their 175-year lifespans, showing little or no signs of age until they pass 150. At 101 years old, Jerome was still in his prime, old enough to have acquired a great degree of wisdom accompanied by the high intelligence Minister were noted for. An intelligence so great that the need for magic was deemed non-existent among the species. In fact, the use of magic was a crime which carried severe penalties with the High Court. Logic, reason, intellect, and law were the concepts the Minister held in esteem. Standing 7'1", intelligent, educated, wise, and strong, Jerome was indeed a force to be reckoned with. But why was Jerome stripped of his rank? Well, the reasons were these. Because in his heart, he knew the opinions of the court were erroneous. The High Minister Court maintained that species other than Minister were subhuman, on the level of animals. They believed that magic was but an uncouth practice of the ignorant, used to compensate for lack of intelligence. They believed that sex served but one purpose, reproduction. Deriving pleasure from a sexual act was also considered a crime on the same level as that of practicing magic by the High Minister Court. Pleasure of that nature was only to be derived through splendetta. Once Jerome made the convictions of his heart known to the members of the court, he was stripped of rank and sentenced to death. But his associations with species of lesser intellect, but greater magic, allowed him to escape the Minister. He now lived in exile, yet in spite of being considered a disgrace by his own people, Jerome considered himself blessed. He did not need the approval of the High Court to justify his sense of self-worth, but none of that mattered right now, although it wasn't uncommon for the Order of Panatesis to torture and kill proc-ogres. The two species did despise each other after all. They never allowed the Dysilry to be occupied by even one, let alone many ogres. What did this mean? Jerome decided to call it a night. He had been watching the Dysilry for hours now, and he needed to clear his mind, to rest, and perhaps to enjoy the company of a gnome maiden. There was a splurt house an hour's walk up the road in the humanoid city of Harless, and a bit of gnomish pleasure would definitely be a sweet diversion at this point. Or perhaps an encounter with a gnome and an elf maiden would be the respite he needed to rejuvenate his weary mind. And besides, there was another matter at the splurt house that needed tending to.